Take a quick look here at articles by Alexandra Kollontai on the topic of International Working Women's Day, or the abbreviated version of Women's Day, which is now currently celebrated on March 8th and got started in 1913 officially. So yeah, this first article she wrote in 1913, pretty much like just before Women's Day, she sort of lays out like a brief defense of the of a Women's Day as like a unique thing under the umbrella of the greater workers' movement at the time. And generally, that's kind of what she lays out here. Is it's pretty cool if you're at all familiar with sort of the general history of like feminist theory and like kind of thought philosophy at large. Like nowadays we have pretty well developed frameworks of like intersectionality and sort of things like this, and it's pretty cool to see that all the way back in 1913, Kollontai is already pretty like very much aware of this as a fact. So, and I think she mentions it here, right? Mentioning that the backwardness and lack of rights suffered by women, their subjection and indifference are of no benefit to the working class and indeed are directly harmful to it. And then asking the question of like, how are these women workers going to be awoken and sort of brought into the movement? And she quickly touches on like why this might have been a failure in previous organizing efforts, and the general gist of it, as I'm reading it at least, is when she says like the working class did not realize that the woman worker is the most legally and socially deprived member of that class, and that she's browbeaten, intimidated, and persecuted down the centuries, and that in order to stimulate her mind and heart, a special approach is needed. Words understandable to her as a woman. So again, to me, that's reading is her developed like political consciousness is, and the way she's explaining it is pretty much lockstep with theory of intersectionality, right? Where like different identities do result in basically different modes of oppression, and that the like a male member of the working class and a female member of the working class do not experience the same types of oppression or intensity of oppression, and as so on and so forth. And obviously intersectionality is a little more broad in its scope, and that extends out to all kinds of gender identities, sexual orientations, ethnicities, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, she lays that out, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool to see that was already being kind of developed by specifically socialist feminists or proletarian feminists, and kind of took the mainstream of feminist thought to significantly longer to catch up with this observation and this like understanding. Good on them. And then let's see. Right here, she basically proposes as a organizing tactic, basically for including more women in the workers' movement at the time. She says that now the main burden of the work to attract more working women into the socialist movement lies with women. So again, this kind of in the theme of like greater feminist philosophy and thought, the idea of like a standpoint or basically have a certain social context, or I know as Marxists we always are harping on about the material conditions, right? Material conditions, blah blah blah, but material conditions also include a social context, or like the social conditions, right? Because even though social relations are not technically material in the sense that you cannot like touch them or measure them, etc. They are objective. They are definitely real, and they definitely impact people's lives in real, tangible ways. And that it is much easier to empathize and sort of communicate more effectively with those who share a very similar standpoint to your own. All right, so I'm sure, if any of us have had the displeasure of speaking at length with a member of like the capitalist class, or even like a petty bourgeois, or basically someone who has their head up their ass, basically, you have that experience of like, wow, they're like totally disconnected from my reality. They're out of touch. It's almost like we have a communication barrier. That is definitely something that's been developed in a lot of feminist thought. Basically, is that if you don't share a certain standpoint with somebody, it can be difficult to accurately convey what that's like to somebody else. But if you are talking to someone who shares a standpoint with you, then your communication is going to be significantly easier. I'm not gonna like say it's impossible necessarily. Like, certainly finding sympathy or empathy with your comrades from all kinds of backgrounds. I mean, you should definitely strive to do that as much as possible. Yeah, I think just basically the barrier to communication, the barrier to entry is much easier if you kind of share certain background with people, whether it be class or gender, what, like any sort of dimension of your social identity. And yeah, so that was like her proposal there. And she also asks this question, or is sort of addressing this question, I should say, that, is this type of Women's Day like singling out women workers? It's, she basically answers it like, is this, or she says, is it not like in the final analysis a concession to the feminists and bourgeois suffragettes? And actually, a good note to make here. I think in 1913, very few countries had given women the right to vote, even in sort of like a bourgeois, like, democratic republic situation. Like sort of, even if it was like
a little bit more. Sorry, she gives a little bit more context to that in her 1920 article as well.
She does.
Provides actually a lot more historical context, even what she's writing here. So we can get to that.
Yep. But generally speaking, I think what she's referring to, at least for now, is that the primary goal of a lot of the bourgeois feminists at the time was like just getting the right to vote, with very little emphasis on any sort of structural change, as you might expect. Because echoing. Okay. So yeah, and then she, just to finish the article up, she basically explains how like proletarian feminists and women workers and bourgeois suffragettes have long since separated. And that she says there's too great a difference between the objectives that life has put before them. There's too great a contradiction between the interests of the women worker and the lady proprietress, between the servant and her mistress. There are not and cannot be any points of contact, conciliation, or convergence between them, and therefore working men should not fear separate women's days, nor special conferences of women workers, nor their special press. So she's basically, I don't know, easing some concerns that people might have had. She's saying, listen, just because we're having solidarity amongst women does not mean we're, having solidarity with bourgeois women, because that's not the point. They have very different material interests than we do. And, she kind of affirms that by saying, the cause of the women workers is the exact same as the cause of the working class at large. Um, the Venn diagram is just a circle, basically. So there's no need for worrying about sort of a split in the party or I don't know, class collaborationism or something like that. Okay, any other comments or questions on that before we jump over to the other one?
We have a couple things. For one, like this is like kind of for the first Women's Day in Russia, but it had been celebrated in other countries prior to 1913. And she does address that a little bit at the very beginning, where she says such questions can still be heard in Russia, but they're no longer heard abroad. And this is kind of speaking to, Russian proletarian women specifically, saying, our comrades abroad have already kind of gone through this entire thought process. They've come to these certain conclusions, and that makes this a case for Women's Day in Russia as well as among the working women everywhere else in the world. And she discusses this a little bit in the beginning of the 1920 article, but that essentially a lot of the roots of International Women's Day had a lot of its origins in the United States of all places. But a few other things that stood out to me about this were that, for one, you can almost kind of feel like she's belittling women who don't work in the traditional sense, but you have to kind of be careful not to take that away, because she does acknowledge that household work and motherhood is work to a degree, in the sense that most women who stay home, raise children, keep the household have far more in common typically with women who are in the labor force than they do with the women of the bourgeoisie and of the even the petite bourgeoisie. And kind of the crux of her argument, to a degree, is that to have women speaking to them specifically is going to get more of their attention than to have any sort of this information being filtered through men, whether it is their husband or their fathers or whomever. I guess the second whole paragraph at the end, she says, what level of consciousness is possessed by a woman who sits by the stove, who has no rights in society, the state, or the family? She has no ideas of her own. Everything is done as ordered by the father or the husband. And that's kind of the implication there, is that when communicated by women or through women, this message of liberation, this message of solidarity, it's far more likely to awaken a political consciousness or a class consciousness in a stay-at-home mother, in a woman whose only work is to maintain the whole household, because without that additional perspective, the stay-at-home mother is not going to feel like she has anything in common with a working man or a laboring man, as she would to a laboring woman who, on top of perhaps her job in a factory or or wherever is also raising a family, is also managing a household.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of good points. Yeah, thanks for the correction. This is the first one in Russia, but yeah. Um, yeah, it's an interesting problem at that time. It's like kind of, it's a little difficult to imagine, I guess, for maybe for us in the modern era of, but I know this still does happen of the archetypical like stay-at-home mom or something who like, yeah, there's not like a lot of contact with other sort of members of the working class, so to speak. Um, so there's not like that solidarity between your coworkers that a lot of us might experience, but that's kind of one of the issues, right? That she's bringing up now. Maybe back in the early 1900s, part of that was much more structural. It still is to a certain extent, but I think it also is just a lot of kind of cultural hegemony after effect. Because back then, it was probably more of a matter of like complete lack of accessibility. Um, like a lot of times, women weren't even allowed in the workforce, and we talk about that in Capital for we definitely mentioned it.
Where women were essentially excluded from the First International because in a number of countries, I think France was called out particularly, any work that women did was immediately considered unskilled labor and was subject to lower wages. So women were, to a degree, initially frozen out of the working class organizing structure, largely because their mere presence, due to law, or custom, would result in setting back a lot of the hard-won concessions that much of the labor organizing had already gotten. So another kind of undercurrent, I think you're right, to this is to say that part of the reason why Women's Day exists and is necessary is because they were structurally frozen out of the working class organizing by men, historically going back, I think, well, to the time the Capital was written. So from here is roughly about 50 years. So to that end, that does make a fairly good argument for, sometimes if you, or, so as women, if we see that, yes, the proletarian solidarity is an important thing, and that ultimately it can result in improving conditions for all people, not just men, not just women, but because there are structural and social issues that prevent women from perhaps always being able to organize with men, or being able to participate in the same types of organizational actions as men, that to a degree, until a more equitable society can be reached, uh, two separate struggles to a degree have to be waged.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example historically of sort of the divide and conquer strategy within class struggle, right? When the working class at large is struggling against capital, um, I mean that I think that would be a good example when the capitalists are saying, "Oh well, if we're hiring a woman, we're just straight up will pay her less," kind of because she's a woman, but like you said, because we consider her labor less valuable or something like that. then that
To that
like
degree, I mean, yeah, but I
it
mean,
works as
what
a
does a man
divide and
care if
conquer
a woman's
strategy,
getting?
right? It's
Yeah.
like without the kind of awareness that that's what's happening. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
they're trying to do the divide and conquer strategy, and I think
Right.
her point is like we need to
And
resist that
yeah,
and not fall for that kind of shit.
precisely. Precisely. I mean, because the issue was that to get men to oppose the inclusion of women in the workforce and the liberation of women as a whole, um, if women started doing the same job as them, the wages would become suppressed. Their wages would drop as well, which is to say, the men's wages. And you saw something similar in the American South, particularly at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where you would have labor organizing that became segregated for largely the same reason, though they had the same aims, typically blacks and whites, had the same aims to better working conditions and better wages. Um, in a lot of places, any workplace that employed blacks would have their wages depressed either by law or by custom. So white workers did not want to have black workers in their factories because it would bring down their own wages. And there are several examples, particularly within the textile industry, where union organizing was broken up by this strategy specifically. So whether it's gender or race, it is definitely a common thing. And I think what the crux of Kollontai's argument is, and what you were mentioning about intersectionality within class struggle, is that you can have parallel struggles toward the same goal that speak slightly different languages to essentially smooth over the differences that have been projected by capital.
Yeah, there's a reason like a lot of um, progressive movements uh, tend to have to, even if they don't start out with, they will eventually develop a very Marxist framework, eventually, like on a long enough timeline. Um, and that's not because they all love Marx necessarily, but it's because Marx's analysis, being very scientific, and he was obviously much more focused on like just kind of a boiled down version of class struggle. I think a lot of progressive movements kind of eventually, inevitably encounter like, oh, this is like one front of the greater class war, basically. If you want to think of it that way. Um, that's how I like to think of it, at least. Like if you have there's a
Yeah,
world war
you might
basically, and
have
everyone's on their own little battlefield. Yeah,
you might have, dozens of progressive movements working within, different conditions, different frameworks, anywhere. Some of them may have never, read Marx or any kind of theory in their life, and I'm going to say that's probably more common than not. And eventually they all converge on roughly the same conclusions about how to operate. And
yeah.
they do typically, you're correct, within a Marxist framework, which I feel kind of reinforces to a significant degree the at least general correctness of Marxist conclusions.
Yeah, and even the theory of intersectionality, when I was introduced to it, like I took a class, feminist philosophy, and we read a bunch of papers right in the beginning about all those foundational texts, and the whole time I was reading it, I'm like, this is literally just dialectics. Like
Mhm.
they just aren't using that. Well, I did eventually find some papers that actually do the synthesis of that, of basically breaking down, oh, intersectionality is basically just applying a dialectical approach to gender studies, basically, um, and just sort of if you want to like the identity politics in general. I know that gets a bad rap even amongst Marxists, but it's like, yeah, I mean, if we're thinking dialectically and we're focused on the relations between things and between people, social relations happen to be pretty damn important. Turns out, um, and since Marx sort of comes up with this framework of analyzing a very, a specific social relation, like Capital Volume 1 is very specifically analyzing the social relation between capital and labor. And he kind of abstracts a lot of other things about that, right? He kind of will bring up things and say, yeah, this kind of matters, but I'm going to like abstract it and just pretend like it's not there. It's like in any science experiment where you just say, oh, I'm assuming all these other variables are controlled, right?
Yeah.
But in the real world,
assume no wind resistance, assume a spherical chicken, that kind of
frictionless,
thing.
blah blah blah, all that fun stuff. But,
Ideal.
And I mean, Marx is upfront with that these are abstractions, which means it's not. He can't possibly do like a exhaustive analysis. He would never would have finished it. But he kind of he laid out this initial framework, and most of that was done in Capital. But then like that same framework can be applied to other social relations, right? Race as a social relation, like a social construct. You can basically do a very, very similar analysis and break down how did it develop historically, and how does it continue to develop like according to the material conditions and sort of the progression of society. You can do that same thing with gender relations. So you can apply a very similar approach. And that's what I mean by saying that, like, even if a lot of these progressive movements may have started in various ways, of, the initial theorists, whoever started writing about this stuff, because generally speaking, like, whenever a social relation is developed or is constructed, usually the critique to it is also developed basically simultaneously. And they develop alongside of each other, right? So just like how Marx was the most recent critic of capitalism at the time, and there had been others before him, like the utopian socialists and so on. He just had capitalism, and therefore the critique of capitalism had both developed to the point where it was able to be analyzed like scientifically. And I think this does happen in basically all progressive movements eventually. Which personally is why like Marxist feminist writers are super like interesting to read, because they are very aware of that. They know that the framework is essentially the same, and Kollontai is very much in that like school of thought. Definitely one of the earliest.
You definitely see she uses dialectics in her writing quite consistently and quite heavily.
All right, let's get to the other one. All right, so yeah, it's funny because actually I did read this one first, and then read the second one. I guess I had just kind of forgotten like how much context is missing in the original article because it's so much shorter. But yeah, this one's pretty solid. This is almost like because this was 7 years after the first article, so it is kind of like a history of Women's Day, which is pretty cool, along with just some more commentary. And in general, she's kind of just elaborating on a lot of what she laid out first, the first article. So she introduces it here. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. As I say, aside from just the 7-year gap, it's also interesting to note that the first one was written prior to the revolution, and this one was written a couple of years after.
Also, I don't remember if the the narrator in the Socialism for All video, I can't remember if he mentioned it, but was she in the Menshevik camp when she wrote the first one, and then she was in the Bolsheviks during the writing of this article?
I think so, and I think that's mentioned in a footnote
Okay.
of this article. Um,
Oh yeah. Let's see.
I think footnote 5.
Let's see. Split in 1912, right? Yeah. So joined the Bolsheviks in 1915. Yeah. So she would have. I mean, that's probably a minor difference, to be honest. I mean,
Especially at the time.
I was gonna say in the first article, I don't think I would have been able to tell you if, but like if she was mentioned for a Bolshevik. But yeah, it's an interesting point.
Footnote, and they give the
Also,
translations of what Bolshevik, of what Bolshevik and Menshevik mean, and me, a casual Russian speaker of not that well, looking at that and I go, oh, how did I not notice that before?
Yep. Wait, what was wrong? What did you notice again?
Oh, that Bolshevik means majority and Menshevik means minority. And so Bolshoi means big and Menshie means little or small. And I'm like, oh yeah, they do love their root words.
Okay. There you go. Just learned some Russian. Ooh. Okay, yeah, so let's see here. Alright, so let's start here, I guess. Where she's saying, this is actually taking it back to its beginning and around the original organization of Women's Day. So she lays out here that the bourgeois basically did not want to strengthen the vote of the working class in various different parliaments and so forth. So naturally, barring essentially 50% of your population from voting is a pretty damn effective way to do that. And yeah, she basically talks about the U.S. So I'll read this real quick. She says, socialists in North America insisted upon their demands for the vote with particular persistence. On the 28th of February in 1909, the Women Socialists of the USA organized huge demonstrations and meetings all over the country demanding political rights for working women. And this was the first quote-unquote Women's Day. The initiative for organizing Women's Day thus belongs to the working women of America. So good on the U.S. And I'm almost curious. I'm sure there's been like more literature written on this, but that would be interesting to read some more. Because that's something yeah, that's something that like I always, or at least our professor kind of like skimmed over in that feminism class, is sort of like the history of it. Obviously, it's a philosophy class, so we're focused on the actual philosophy of it all. But yeah, the actual history, the whole like first wave, second wave type stuff like that, I would be definitely interested in. Anyways, yeah, so Clara Zetkin, at the Second International, brought up this proposal to kind of make it like an official day of celebration, and the original slogan here: "Vote for women will unite our strength in the struggle for socialism." Pretty cool. And by the way, this was actually after I listened to the audiobook version, I think in the recommendeds was the John Oliver like clip of International Women's Day. It's only like 10 minutes, so out of morbid curiosity, I was like, all right, what did he have to say about it? It was kind of lame, but the most lame part of it all, not a single peep in the entire video that it was organized by socialists. Of course.
I mean, if you look at anything, that's kind of big and out there about International Women's Day, because the UN has done a lot to kind of co-opt it, and you see a lot of more mainstream stuff, a lot of the kind of corporatization of it. And like you were mentioning, even in your feminist philosophy class, things came up, I'm assuming, about the origins of feminism and feminist philosophy, which are largely inextricable from the political movement, at least early on.
Yeah.
It's not entirely surprising that the socialism has gotten scrubbed out of it, because that happens in
To be fair,
most
to my
American
professor,
perspective history.
to be fair to the professor of that class, she was actually super fucking based. Because we read the autobiographies of Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, freaking Simone de Beauvoir, all communists. So
It's entirely
it was like pretty.
that the professor's like,
yeah, she basically was trying to like
yeah,
do the subtext thing.
right? Because a
Like,
lot of professors,
I was
if
picking up
say
what she
the
was putting
S
down, but
word,
maybe
they're in
other people
trouble.
were. Yeah, I think a lot
Yeah.
of the other people in
Plausible
that class were
deniability.
like, yeah, they're like, oh my god, like they're like 10 chapters in, and they're like, oh my god, she's a communist. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Yeah, like pretty much. I'm like, yeah, pretty much like 80% of like the serious like foundational feminists are also Marxists or communists or something like that. So yeah, not it's like if you know even just like the intro version of feminist history, like yeah, they're pretty much all socialists, guys. Like honestly, I almost feel like a lot of the like liberal feminism almost developed like post World War II, I think, when basically when the Cold War started really flaring up. Because like I guess at least I guess I only know the American side of this history best, but at least in America, where women get the right to vote in 1920, I think, right? And start 1945-ish is the start of the Cold War, which is where you would expect the propaganda machine to basically be like, oh shit, we need to distance all sort of, International Women's Day or anything feminist. We need to distance it from socialism like as quickly as possible, because now the number one socialist power in the world is our number one enemy. So I think that is the turning point in history where you see like a noticeable divergence from like the liberal kind of bourgeois feminism and the socialist Marxist feminism. And that split has been around, obviously, for as long as feminism
even mentions it.
It's been around, but but when she's talking about it, she's saying that the bourgeois sect or whatever is pretty much only focused on like the right to vote, whereas the socialist wing is like, yeah, that's like the bare fucking minimum. Like, we want basically everything else that the working class movement is also interested in. But yeah, I think at least in terms of like a noticeable divergence in like the big thinkers, I think around the start of the Cold War is where you start to see like liberal feminists really start to be like serious like anti-communists and shit like that.
I can't think of anything specifically that discusses that, but that definitely feels right.
Yeah, it was mostly just a matter of all the papers we were reading. It was like pretty much, it seemed like all the really old school feminists were based as fuck. And a lot of the more modern ones were like, ugh. Like,
Yeah,
but
to a
obviously our
degree.
professor also made sure to include plenty of Marxist feminist thinkers too. Like I'm
Yeah,
99% sure she was Marxist as well, but
yeah. Yeah, because to a degree, there definitely was. I mean, you still kind of maintained some degree of at least leftist thinking within. I guess it would be like the are those first wave, second wave feminists in the '60s and maybe early '70s, as you're talking.
yeah,
Things like reproductive rights and the like. Though I feel like
right. So I
that
believe,
almost supplanted. I feel like that supplanted voting rights as the core aim of the liberal feminists
yeah. So
of the time.
I believe the abbreviated history is something like, so the major split in first wave was pretty much what Kollontai is describing, right? It's the more conservative wing of feminism basically just wanted the right to vote, but like leave everything else as normal, run of the mill liberalism, and versus the basically all the socialists and communist feminists who are like, no, that's just we don't we don't want to live under capitalism to be exploited just like the men are. And then the second wave feminism split was more along because that would have been basically after universal suffrage was, well, mostly universal at least. So the new issue that got split over was essentially what formed intersectionality, I think, where it was like
Mm.
it was a racial dimension mostly, where you had the mostly white, mostly bourgeois feminists, also mostly liberal, who basically said that like, oh, all women basically face oppression equally. Like we all are women, therefore we all experience the same things. Based in a ton of um, women from minority backgrounds, especially like black women in America. There's like a lot of cool call them and is it anthologies maybe? They're like collections of essay.
Anthropologists?
Yeah, they're like
Oh,
collections of
wait,
essays.
oh, yeah, anthologies.
I guess it is an anthology. Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
but
I
yeah,
wasn't sure if you were talking the people or the writing.
well, there's some writings and there's too many people in the name, but
Yeah.
although I'll double check some of the authors later. But yeah, that was one of the major splits. That was second wave. I think is the split in basically um, along like mostly racial lines, but that's sort of where the theory of intersectionality was like more thoroughly developed. Is the idea that actually women from even more marginalized backgrounds, who are not bourgeois, who are not white, who are not wealthy, are even like more oppressed than their white, wealthy, liberal counterparts, and therefore they do not necessarily share the same amount of like same type of oppression, same intensity of oppression, and so on. And then I don't. Is third wave have to do with like the
I
gender
feel
and
like
sexuality
this.
distinction?
Yeah, I think third wave was kind of the split as far as like gender, sexuality, sex positivity, because yeah, you can tell the difference between a second wave feminist and a third wave feminist based on how likely they are to either A, be a turf, or
Right.
B, slut shame.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That I think that makes sense. Um.
Because a lot
Yeah.
of second wave feminists, while they were sex positive to a degree as far as like ability to control your reproductive rights and things like that, they viewed things like pornography and sex work as inherently degrading to women without examining closer the essentially material conditions surrounding that.
Yeah. I actually am. hmm. Are we like on? Are we like on fourth wave now? Like what wave are we at?
Uh,
I don't even
yeah,
know.
I feel like at this point, I feel like we've just given up on labels at this point.
Well, usually they get labeled well after the issue
Yeah,
is like
yeah,
been beat to death. But honestly, like, the intense level of discrimination that a lot of our trans comrades are facing right now, like, feel like that type of same struggle that
that,
previous waves of, like, quote unquote waves of feminism have
yeah,
gone through before.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure there's,
Though
again, it's one of those where I'm sure there's literature on it already, and I just am not caught up, basically.
going back to the point that you were making about sort of the difference between socialist feminism and liberal feminism being largely that liberal feminism tends to focus on specific individual rights, whereas socialist feminism, it seems to be far more big picture, goes back to something that Marx was also saying in Capital, and I can't for the life of me find the exact quote right now, where he kind of distinguishes the difference between between philosophies of people thinking that that rights are sort of the be all and end all of of I guess kind of getting what you need or being protected in some way, and rather than saying, okay, so I have these rights and the state's going to protect me in this way, without kind of looking closer at the sort of class implications of why those rights exist. I can't think of. I swear it was somewhere in chapter 10 because it's still pretty fresh in my mind, but um, but where he definitely was making a distinction of the rights that you're given versus the rights that you essentially need to insist on. Um, that just kind of it sparked something in my memory, that where that definitely lines up with the sort of comparison that both Kollontai and we've been making about the difference between the styles of feminism.
Yeah, and
I don't think
I
I don't
shouldn't
think I'm going to
be,
find that.
hopefully not too surprising to any of us here, that in all of these quote unquote waves of feminist theory throughout the ages, the line basically that gets adopted by the next generation is pretty much always the socialist one, or the one that the more progressive elements were supporting, right? So generally speaking, uh, you know, it's more, the socialist lines are almost always more widely accepted, and like you said, anyone who's clings to the old lines of, like, the more conservative feminists, mostly liberal feminists, they're just widely understood to be very cringe. Yeah, and I guess Kollontai kind of
Just
lays
kind of
out.
moving back to,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah.
Did you
I
find
was
what you were
thinking.
looking for?
I was just saying. No, I was going to say moving back to Kollontai and talking about the start of International Women's Day. So you can go ahead with that.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. So yeah, she's laying out some more history here. Um, so she says the question of making Parliament more democratic, of widening the franchise and extending the vote to women was a vital issue. And she says before the First World War, the workers had the right to vote in all bourgeois countries except Russia. Although I think, did one of the footnotes correct that?
The footnote says, yeah, that like
Yeah.
French women didn't get the right to vote until like after World War II,
Yeah, she's being far
and
too
in the United
generous,
States, yeah,
basically.
yeah, kind of one of those. You look at other countries like, oh, they have it so much better, but if you don't, oh, but only if you don't look too closely.
Yeah. So that was,
And I
she was
think that's
being,
what's going on here.
yeah, she's being far, far too generous to most of those countries. Um, because yeah, like, what is it? France didn't get the right, women didn't get the right to vote in France till like after World War II. Wild.
Mhm.
That was one of the weirdest things, by the way, of reading Simone de Beauvoir's autobiography is like it's noticeably different than, for example, Angela Davis, because Beauvoir was like pretty clearly like petty bourgeois, or like, yeah, just she's basically petty bourgeois, and so like in most of her writing, she literally doesn't like her autobiography in the period of obviously before World War II is like she almost never mentions that she like can't vote as like it being an issue. It's kind of weird. Like she's kind of renowned as this like legendary so like feminist thinker, and in a lot of ways she definitely is. But at least in her even in her own autobiography, it's like, oh, I can't vote. Who cares? It's like, oh, well, that kind of betrays your class interests just a little bit. Uh, because for a lot of women, that was like a fucking huge deal.
Yeah.
So, anyways, just thought I'd throw that out there too. Just an interesting thing.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
Let's see. All right. So she says down here. In the last years before the war, the rise in prices forced even the most peaceful housewife to take an interest in questions of politics and to protest loudly against the bourgeois economy of plunder. These housewife uprisings became increasingly frequent, flaring up at different times in Austria, England, France, and Germany. Working women understood that it wasn't enough to break up the stalls of the market or threaten the odd merchant. They understood that such action doesn't bring down the cost of living. You have to change the politics of the government. And to achieve this, the working class has to see that the franchise is widened. I guess the first part of that paragraph is exactly what I was describing. The difference between Beauvoir's writing or autobiography versus Angela Davis, for example. Because when Angela Davis is describing her childhood, it's like her parents were also kind of well off because teachers, but like it's not like teachers are still killing it out there.
Yeah. I
Like
mean,
the
you're
poverty is like noticeable
yeah.
in those autobiographies where like it's, and I know this is probably not unique to her, or it's probably common amongst many of us, but like, you hear your parents, for example, like discussing freaking bills at the dinner table, like gotta make gotta make payments and shit like that. So yeah, if you're a woman who has like the, it's called privilege of being petty bourgeois or bourgeois, like basically you're just very well off, you're not concerned about making money through working for somebody, yeah, you're gonna have a pretty different perspective on things. But if you're these people she's describing who are like in the bread lines, um, and the prices are getting crazy, you're ready to go to fucking war, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course they're gonna have like a different perspective, and also find a lot of solidarity with the working class movement at large. Um, all right, so now she jumps into the second international, or like when they officially made the date and all that. So she says this. Let's see. They decided to hold the first day on the 19th of March.
Mhm.
Excuse me. She says it was not chosen at random. Um, our German counterparts picked the day because of its historic importance for the German proletariat. On the 19th of March in the year of 1848, the Prussian king recognized for the first time the strength of the armed people and gave way before the threat of the proletarian uprising. Among the many promises he made, which he later failed to keep, was the introduction of votes for women. So that's pretty cool. And then was it another footnote? Maybe, or it might have just been the audiobook version. But did it say like uh because the Russian calendar is different or something? That
That actually, why it's on the 8th of March versus the 19th? You mean?
Yeah.
Oh, so no, it ends up being on the 8th of March eventually. Um, no, it had nothing to do with the calendar for that. It was that it was celebrated on the 23rd of March because of the different, or sorry, 23rd of February in Russia because it was different starting in 1913. But that was because they changed the date to the 8th of March internationally, though Kollontai does not seem to mention why they moved it to the 8th. From
After
the
I skimmed the wiki a little bit, and I guess it is kind of unclear, or like there's different interpretations of why it was moved. Like, one of them was like in reference to some uh like a strike or something in America from like way back in like the 1860s or something. But I think historians are like, nah, that's probably not it. Like it's too obscure. It just so happened to be on March 8th or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what the exact reason is either. But whatever. I
but
guess yeah.
in any case, it seems like they weren't treating the date as particularly sacrosanct until 1917.
Yep. Oh well, now like you said in the corporatized version, it's just now it's all it's just Women's History Month for all of
Oh yeah,
March, I think.
yeah, because they
So
basically like, hey, let's pick a let's pick a month for like every you know every particular group, and if there happens to be a holiday within like that month maybe or something.
yeah, that's there's not much rhyme or reason. Although actually that's not true. I guess the rhyme or reason is to overshadow the actual holidays that are usually commemorating some historical event. It's kind of like the
Yeah,
whole
potentially.
like it's kind of like making up Labor Day and like ignoring May Day. It's like that kind of shit.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
The
so
rest of the world celebrates Labor Day in May, and the United States is over here like September.
yeah, just make it up. All right, so she says that the first Women's Day was awesome, had amazing results. Um, and she says it's true that not a single bourgeois parliament thought of making concessions to the workers or of responding to the women's demands, because at that time the bourgeois was not threatened by a socialist revolution. Interesting. Um, but she says it did achieve something. It turned out, above all, to be an excellent method of agitation among the less political of our proletarian sisters. They could not help but turn their attention to the meetings, demonstrations, posters, pamphlets, and newspapers that were devoted to Women's Day. Even the politically backward working women thought to herself, "This is our day, the festival for working women," as she heard to the meetings and demonstrations. After each Working Women's Day, more women joined socialist parties and the trade unions grew. Organizations improved and political consciousness developed. So, you know, we're
To that end,
we're doing some.
don't discount the I'm going to say perfunctory parts of you know honestly anything, but in this case particularly Women's Day. Because hey, even if you are just even if you're making a Facebook post about it or whatever, if it seems interesting enough, even your mom who's like, I don't really like politics, might be like, heck yeah, women.
That's right. And then you just be like, yeah, read this article by this famous feminist, and they'll be like, oh hell yeah.
Yep, yep. That's exactly how that works.
And then just send this link to them. Easy peasy. It's actually honest. I'm not even kidding. Like, I wonder. I'll have to find the PDF version of this because, like, I know the fucking URL is Marxist.org, which
Yeah, I
is
was
like
gonna say.
for a
Yeah.
lot of libs is like a red flag. They're gonna be like, "Ew,
I,
gross." But
I
like,
think the what is it? Alexandra Kollontai.com. Do they no, they linked all the Marxist.org ones
there's
now.
yeah,
They used to host them all themselves, but not anymore.
yeah.
But
If
I'm
someone would
sure you
like
could find a
to,
mirror of this somewhere.
yeah, if someone in the chat would like to track down the PDF and uh, pop it in the channel, that'd be nice. If not, I can try and do it right. I know there's a PDF of it somewhere, but yeah, share it with folks you want to maybe introduce to like Kollontai writings, because it's honestly super. I don't know. It's fun to read, and it's like pretty. It's really interesting because it's got that history. It's got the theory. It's got a nice mix of stuff going on, and I don't think it. I mean, to us, it is like obviously clearly written by a Marxist, but I feel like to someone who isn't in the know, it doesn't. It's not immediately obvious. Then again, I don't know. It's been so long since I've read any any work of theory where I wasn't familiar with Marxism. I don't remember what that would be like. So I guess I'm just speculating. Anyways, the other thing I was going to mention though is the um, again with Kollontai's use of dialectics is pretty cool here, right? This is like a um, pretty good example of the whole like quantitative change leading to qualitative change, right? So yeah, we didn't get the quote unquote like qualitative result, which would be like universal suffrage. We didn't get that, the first time. They didn't just the bourgeois didn't just immediately fold and say, yeah, okay, we'll give you the right to vote. But, you keep having this year after year after year. You raise the consciousness of more and more people, more and more women, and more people, and women get involved. And eventually it'll culminate in like a pretty huge proportion of the population is like, hey, what the fuck? We really want the right to vote. Like, and eventually it will add up over time and, hopefully lead to the results that we're looking for. Good old fashioned organizing work. Yeah, and let's see. Also, she mentions, right, strengthening international solidarity, which is cool. The, German comrades going to England, England going to Holland, blah, blah, blah. Pretty cool. And yeah, also, I'll read this too. She says the results of Working Women's Day of Militancy, but these are the results. The Day of Working Women's Militancy helps increase the consciousness and organization of proletarian women, and this means that its contribution is essential to the success of those fighting for a better future, the working class. So yeah, it's good even if its effect is sort of subtle. Those subtle effects add up over time, year after year. So yeah, this is going over the Russian situation. So starting in 1913, when she wrote the original article, she says that this is a time of reaction when Tsarism held the workers and peasants in its vice like a grip. There'd be no thought of celebrating Working Women's Day by open demonstrations, but the organized working women were able to mark their international day. Both the newspapers of the working class, the Bolshevik Pravda, and the Menshevik Luch, carried articles about the International Women's Day, and they carried special articles, portraits of those taking part, and greetings from comrades such as Bevel and Zetkin. Yeah, so, she talks about how meetings were forbidden in those bleak years of, it was illegal, and yet all these meetings were like packed with women trying to learn as much as they could. It's kind of they can't arrest all of us kind of mentality.
They did apparently arrest some of them, but not all of them. It also goes to show that, if what you have to say is important and worthwhile enough, people will risk a criminal record, going to jail, etc., to hear it, be a part of it.
Definitely. Okay, so next, the other kind of important historical event between 1913 and 1920, which is the First World War. She talks about how, let's see here, the left-wing socialist women who shared their views of the Russian Bolshevik Party tried to turn March 8th into a demonstration of working women against the war. Because I believe that was also one of the big causes for the split between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, was basically the topic of imperialism in as the main thing. But more specifically, should we be supporting the war or not? Obviously Lenin was on the side of fuck no. All the soldiers should take their guns home and go kill their own bourgeois, or their own capitalist class, basically, and so forth. But yeah, so yeah, the working women basically were like, hey, this war is fucked up, because it's just killing people unnecessarily, essentially. What else here? I guess, so we'll jump to 1917 here, the end of the war. She says, then came the great year of 1917. Hunger, cold, and trials of war broke the patience of the women workers and peasant women of Russia. And on the 8th of March, they came out boldly in the streets of Petrograd. The women, some were workers, some were wives of soldiers, demanded bread for our children and return of the husbands from the trenches. At this decisive time, the protest of the working women posed such a threat that even the Tsar's security forces did not dare take the usual measures against the rebels, but looked on in confusion at the stormy sea of people's anger. And she says, the 1917 Working Women's Day has become memorable in history. On this day, the Russian women raised the torch of proletarian revolution and set the world on fire. The February Revolution marks its beginning from this day. So yeah, this is, I guess, this is the,
and
this
that's
is
what
that
International Working Women's Day is fucking cool.
It is, and this is also, I think this is what we're talking about with the calendar situation.
Yeah,
is that for everybody else it would have been March 8th, but I think in Russia it was 23rd of February, hence the February Revolution.
Yeah. The same reason why the October Revolution actually happened in November.
Yeah. Silly old Russians. Let's see. So I feel like that's mostly the history section, if you will. Essentially, she's covering the last 7 to 10 years of the day. So this section is more about kind of what is it about and what are we organizing for? Like, what's the point? So I guess
what now, what next?
Yeah, that kind of fun stuff. So she starts here by saying that rights alone are not enough. We have to learn to make use of them, and the right to vote is a weapon which we have to learn to master for our own benefit and for the good of the workers' republic. In the 2 years of Soviet power, life itself has not been absolutely changed. But we are only in the process of struggling for communism. We are surrounded by the world we have inherited from the dark and repressive past. The shackles of the family, of housework, of prostitution still weigh heavily on the working woman. Working women and peasant women can only rid themselves of the situation and achieve equality in life itself and not just in law if they put all their energies into making Russia a truly communist society. So yeah, it's. I mean, this has some parallels even in like, I think some of Mao's writings, where Mao talks about during, during the revolution and even slightly post-revolutionary period, the class struggle only intensifies, especially due to sort of like the rampant and rapid increase in class consciousness throughout the masses, so to speak. And I think
That
she's
would be kind of
reflecting.
the idea of like constant revolution. You would agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even if you consider, because I know there's that distinction of like the revolution as a singular incident and as a process, because it's sort of both at the same time. I mean that's a lot of Marx. Marx does that a lot, right? Something can be a thing and a process
well, I mean,
at the same time.
but if I'm not but you were mentioning Mao, and if memory serves, Mao is the one who kind of more notably talked about basically the idea of constant revolution, where
right.
a revolution does not just happen once. Like, in order to keep society and to move from a socialist society into communism, you essentially have to be constantly having revolution, not just within society, but within yourself, within your family, within every kind of increasingly large unit, with social unit, to kind of transform society.
Yeah, exactly.
I haven't read a lot of Mao, so I could be misrepresenting, but
yep. And I think I want to say that's from On Contradiction, maybe. From when we read that a while back, but yeah, I'm also a little foggy on that, but yeah, it's a similar observation that she's making as to what Mao made. They basically, that's all I'm saying, is they made similar observations, that we shouldn't assume that like we did the revolution, we're good now, we can just chill. It's like no. It's only like that is just getting rid of the biggest barrier, and then from there, like the real work really actually begins of developing like a brand new society, basically, the bones of the old one. But yeah, and I think the other thing that this reflects is sort of that recognition of the difference between the material base and the the superstructure, and sort of cultural elements, which is also something obviously Mao was big into, the whole Cultural Revolution, that sort of deal. Because even though at this point they had, she mentions the Soviet powers, like the Soviets were established and becoming more prominent in people's lives, but it was still very early, and they still had a lot of work to do to kind of shrug off the old, more probably patriarchal and feudalistic and capitalistic ways of doing things, which she mentions as like the shackles of the family, housework, and prostitution, for example. And yeah, those things, even if you do change your mode of production successfully, and that's not an overnight process, but even if you get to there, these sort of shackles she mentions, like those don't necessarily disappear instantly. Those are other things that you have to kind of gradually phase out. But obviously, changing your material base, the material base of society, like how you produce things, basically, is a big foundational stride towards making those superstructural changes much more doable.
The last
Yeah.
paragraph in this section, I think, sums everything up kind of beautifully. Last year, the slogan of the Day of Women Workers was "All victory of the Red Front, all to the victory of the Red Front." Now we call working women to rally their strength on a new bloodless front, the labor front. The Red Army defeated the external enemy because it was organized, disciplined, and ready for self-sacrifice. With organization, hard work, self-discipline, and self-sacrifice, the Workers' Republic will overcome the internal foe, the dislocation of transport and the economy, hunger, cold, and disease. Everyone to the victory on the bloodless labor front, everyone to this victory.
Yep. That does sum it up nicely. And then on the new tasks, she talks about how the situation of women in capitalist countries is still shitty. They're overworked, underprivileged. Um, their voice is still not very well heard. And even if they, like, I guess in the U.S. they would have gotten right to vote like the same year this was written. I don't know if it was before or
About
after
then.
that. Yeah, I guess the exact date.
She does mention in some states of North America, women had won civil rights even before the war. In particular, though women's suffrage was not, I'm going to say universal across every state in the United States, some individual states had women's suffrage far before they had it on a federal level. It's kind of a historical point of interest. A lot of Western territories and states created the right to vote for women in state and local elections specifically to attract more women to come live in the state because they were having issues of not enough men would come out, prospecting for precious metals or to become ranchers or things like that. And the women weren't following. And the right to vote was one of the things that state governments used to entice more women to settle further west in like the Mountain West areas like Wyoming and I think Montana. So I think of note, I think the first woman to be elected to the U.S. Senate was from Montana, and she was elected before women could vote nationally.
Yeah, I don't blame them for not going out west if they couldn't even decide anything. like man, you want me to take this enormous life-changing risk and I don't even have a say in what the fuck happens? Like, man, fuck off.
And I think that's kind of partly what she'd been referring to even in 1913 about some women having the right to vote in America. That even though it didn't happen on a federal level until 1920, the right to vote did exist in small pockets prior to that.
Yep, and she does sum it up nice here about, again, this distinction between like the bourgeois perspective versus the socialist one, right? So she says, but what use are these rights to working women in the framework of bourgeois parliaments? While the power is in the hands of capitalists and property owners, no political rights will save the working women from the traditional position of slavery in the home and society. the French bourgeois are ready to throw another sop to the working class in the face of growing Bolshevik ideas against the proletariat. They are prepared to give women the vote. Eventually, about 25 years later or whatever.
Yeah, it's like they dangle that out there like the carrot for a couple of decades, don't they?
Yeah, freaking France. Okay, so last section here. Mr. Bourgeois, sir, it is too late. After the experience of the Russian October Revolution, it is clear to every working woman in France and England and other countries that only the dictatorship of the working class and only the power of the Soviets can guarantee complete and absolute equality. The ultimate victory of communism will tear down the centuries-old chains of oppression and lack of rights. If the task of the International Working Women's Day was earlier in the face of the supremacy of the bourgeois parliaments to fight for the right of women to vote, the working class now has a new task: organize working women around the fighting slogans of the Third International. Instead of taking part in the working of the bourgeois parliament, listen to the call from Russia. Working women of all countries, organize a united proletarian front in the struggle against those who are plundering the world. Down with the parliamentarianism of the bourgeois. We welcome Soviet power. Away with inequalities suffered by the working men and women. We will fight with the workers for the triumph of the world communism. This call was first heard amidst the trials of a new order in the battles of civil war. It will be heard by, and it will strike a chord in the hearts of working women of other countries. The working women will listen and believe this call to be right. Until recently, they thought that if they had managed to send a few representatives to Parliament, their lives would be easier and the oppression of capitalism more bearable. Now they know otherwise. Only the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of Soviet power will save them from the world of suffering, humiliations, and inequality that make the life of the working woman in the capitalist countries so hard. The Working Women's Day turns from a day of struggle for the franchise, into an international day of struggle for the full and absolute liberation of women, which means a struggle for the victory of the Soviets and for communism. Down with the world of property and the power of capital. Away with inequality, lack of rights, and the oppression of women. The legacy of the bourgeois world. Forward to the international unity of working women and male workers in the struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat of both sexes. Obviously, slightly outdated language, but you get the point.
Yeah. It's like if someone cares to rewrite that for their own little agitprop purposes, I feel like it works pretty well. Also, unlike Marx, where occasionally the footnotes are either unuseful or generally just digs at other writers, the footnotes on here give some pretty good sort of little historical points and contexts.
Yeah, were these written by Kollontai or the person who archived or translated it?
think I think these might have been from the original translator.
Yeah, it kind of reads that way to me.
Yeah.
France, so cringe.
Particularly because it discusses things that very clearly happened after this was written.